Yeah, just to clarify, I don't actually personally, like my company doesn't personally work with the European Commission. I've proofread documents through a client of mine for the European Commission in the past. Uh-huh. Okay. Okay, there we go. So yeah, as Joseph said, I've been in Ukraine for about 5 years now, and I started working as a copy editor and proofreader here in this market. So I work with Ukrainian companies. Most of my clients are IT companies based all around Ukraine. So specifically, I work with marketing departments and sometimes with sales departments of IT companies. So that's my perspective. So I don't actually do translation directly, although occasionally I've translated marketing texts from Russian. I understand Russian quite well, but I don't actually work as a translator. So I'm going to open actually with reading a section from Emerson, from Ralph Waldo Emerson, that I thought of when I was thinking about the context of the camp here. I really like how at this conference we're out in the open. There are chickens literally behind us right now. And it reminded me of this passage from Emerson. So I'm just going to read a little bit of this. Okay. There's Emerson, and this is from Nature. Here's the text in English. I don't know if you can actually see. Can you actually read it from back there? Yeah, I'll back up to this slide then, since you can't read it anyways. Okay. Emerson is writing about language in his essay on nature. He says, "A third use which nature subserves to man is that of language. Nature is the vehicle of thought, and in a simple, double, and threefold degree. 1. Words are signs of natural facts. 2. Particular natural facts are symbols of particular facts. 3. Nature is the symbol of spirit. Words are signs of natural facts. The use of natural history is to give us aid in supernatural history. The use of the outer creation is to give us language for the beings and changes of the inward creation. Every word which is used to express a moral or intellectual fact, if traced to its root, is found to be borrowed from some material appearance. Right originally means straight. Wrong means twisted. Spirit primarily means wind. Transgression, the crossing of a line. Supercilious, the raising of the eyebrow. We say the heart to express emotion, the head to denote thought and emotion are, in their turn, words borrowed from sensible things, and now appropriated to spiritual nature. Most of the process by which this transformation is made is hidden from us in the remote time when language was framed. But the same tendency may be daily observed in children." I'll just stop there. So, what I like about this passage from Emerson is that he gets at the essence of language. It's very philosophical. But this idea that we're connecting with something that can be seen and felt, something that is tangible. And I like to think in part of my role as a copy editor as helping writers root their language, making sure that language is grounded in something that can be felt and understood by the reader, to make the text approachable. This is something that clearly in marketing, text, for instance, can be challenging. It can be challenging to get past the marketing talk or the lingo of a particular industry. So this is the constant challenge. But I like this reminder from Emerson. I think that clearly when we look at Emerson's essays, we feel that on the one hand, they do feel dated to us now. Some of his ways of thinking are a little bit not with the times, but there's this sense still that language is should be connected to something physical and concrete. Okay, so I want to open now with a question to you. I want to get as much participation as I can from the audience during the talk here. So to open, what is the role of an editor? Anybody can give an answer. Okay, to improve copy. All right. Anything else? Anything more specific? To improve in what way?
To try to take a position of a reader and knowing the purpose of the text to see whether it works or not.
Yeah, very good. Anyone else?
To make the text sound natural according to the language it's translated into.
Okay, to make the text sound natural.
To make it sound native.
Okay, to make it sound native.
As if it was written in the language in which it was translated.
Okay, to make it sound native. And what does it mean then for the text to sound native? That's another question that we run into, right? So one problem with the idea of the text sounding native is native to whom? Who do we want the text to sound like? So that's always a question that comes up. So here are some things that I noted about the role of an editor. So the editor helps the writer communicate as clearly as possible. Mediates between the writer and reader. An editor makes sure that a text complies with a publication style and standards. So this is a big one. If I were working for the New Yorker, for instance, then I would need to make sure that we follow the New Yorker's style, including the what some may call excessive use of diacritical marks. Correct grammatical errors, of course. Remove obstacles to the reader. And what I mean by this is anything in the text that can make the reader pause or take a second look or get thrown off track or something. It might be something that is seen by the particular audience as insensitive. So there can be any number of things that create obstacles to the reader. And then query unclear sentences and ideas, right? Sometimes it's not possible to directly, to immediately figure out the best way to solve a particular issue, the best way to revise something. Okay, so what I'm going to present now is based on the professional editorial standards from the Editors Association of Canada. And so these are different levels of editing. And the reason why I want to present these levels is because, and again, this is in my experience here with my clients in this market, I've seen that that not everybody I've worked with has been familiar with kind of the different types of editing and the types of editors who people might want to work with. And so I think it could be useful to understand the different types of editing levels and see what they entail. So also, it's worth noting that not all editors use the same terminology to talk about the levels of editing they use. This is only one breakdown, but I think it's a useful one. It's a good starting point. So we have structural editing. Oh, sorry, I should note before this, there also is developmental editing. But developmental editing is something that I don't think is relevant for us here, because that's something that you do with an author who is still in the draft phase of their book and working with the author on actually developing the book itself. And we're talking here about texts that are already beyond this point. So we have structural editing. Structural editing asks these questions. Is the material right for the audience? Is it organized logically? Looking at the flow of ideas, headings, visuals. What words aren't adding anything to the argument? In other words, what is there that's superfluous, that isn't needed, that doesn't help us get anywhere with the text? Are there any gaps? How might we fill them? Is material presented in the optimal format? This can mean, for instance, would it be best to display certain material in the form of a chart? Would it be best to use bullet points? This is also something that's talked about a fair amount in this particular book here that's on plain English. It's the Oxford Guide to Plain English. And so that's another thing to look at. And then, do we have all the necessary permissions? So it's also the editor's role to make sure that that we have permissions for images or quotes that are needed. Of course, this can also be the responsibility of a legal team and other people, but also the editor should flag these things. Then we have stylistic editing. So we're kind of working down. Structural is the highest level. Stylistic editing, we look for clarity. At the paragraph level, the sentence level, we look for word choice, logic. Logic is actually, I find, a big part even of what I deal with in a lot of texts, because a text can be understood even if there are some grammatical issues. Now, clearly it's not ideal, but you can have a text that's perfectly understandable. When you start running into certain issues with logic, then you start really losing the reader. Then you really start getting into issues that are of a different sort. I actually have, so as you see, I have a stack of books here as props. I like reading, and these are all about writing, except for this one, which is actually called Nonsense, a Handbook of Logical Fallacies. And I'm just promoting it in case anybody would be interested. But this I think is, if I had to recommend one book, I would recommend precisely this book by Robert J. Gula about logic and logical fallacies. It's very practical. Gula taught at the Groton School in the U.S. It's a private boys' school. And this is actually based on things that he taught during his time there. So logic is an important part. Coherence and flow. We're looking at transitions, coherence, length of sentences, length of paragraphs. And then the actual appropriateness for the audience, and eliminating wordiness. Anything that is simply, again, unnecessary isn't helping us get to the point. Then we have what we'll term copy editing. Copy editing looks for correctness, grammar, punctuation, spelling, usage, accuracy, names, dates, math, visuals. Actually, over the few years I've been copy editing full-time, I have been surprised sometimes by the number of times I catch an error with somebody's name in text. So this is something that I always need to stop and Google. It's like you need to make sure that you're getting somebody's name right, even if they're a very well-known person and you think that it's right. Sometimes you need to just stop and do that quick double check. You want to make sure that everything is good there. Yeah, math, visuals, that can be tricky sometimes. Consistency, we mentioned this before about style guide. Do text and visuals correspond? This is another biggie. Sometimes you, well, let's say a visual is changed at the last minute, or data is changed in a graph. Sometimes that change doesn't actually make it into the text, and so you can end up with inconsistencies. And then completeness, links, citations, copyright acknowledgement, do the links work, and things like this. And then we finally have proofreading. And here's a quote from the Professional Editorial Standards. At all proofreading stages, flag or correct egregious errors, but refrain from undertaking structural, stylistic, or copy editing tasks unless authorized to do so. What are egregious errors? Yeah, something that is beyond doubt an error, something that will create a big issue for the reader, something that really prevents the reader from getting the point of what's written. And then, so things that we look at in proofreading: spelling, grammar, punctuation, again. Has all the content made it into the proof? So ideally by the proofreading stage, the content is in its final form, meaning it's actually laid out, and you have all the visuals, and each, what is on page 4 is what will be printed on page 4. Or if it's a website, you actually have the text in the full context, so that you can see for sure how the headings line up, how everything looks visually on the page even, so that you can see the length of things. And yeah, font formatting, overall look and feel. Consistency. Consistency often has to do with things like headings, making sure that everything is of the same type. If you have a certain set of headings, do you have verb phrases? And if you have 3 verb phrases and then you just have a noun, you may want to revise this to make it consistent. And then judgment, use discretion when correcting, querying, and what's reasonable given the budget, time frame, and medium. So this, especially with copy editing, is a real consideration because there are always limits with any project we do in terms of the time that can be allotted, the budget, and by this copy editing stage, there are certain things that if they're not absolutely critical, we just need to let it go at that point. So also I think the principal thing that editorial standards do for an editor is they actually tie our hands a bit. So if we're sticking to editorial standards, then at the proofreading stage, we have to let go of certain things that we might not quite like, but can be just let go because the reader will still get the point, and there's no time and money to deal with it. When I did, so I actually first became familiar with the professional editorial standards of the Editors Association of Canada when I did a copy editing course through Queen's University, which is based in Kensington, Ontario. And one of the most difficult things for me in that course was simply sticking to these standards and not going beyond what is defined as the role at a given stage. And then we have this concept of plain English as an idea. And here's one final quote from Professional Editorial Standards. Certain editing jobs often comprise a bundle of standards at different stages of editing. Plain language editing, for example, might include a mix of structural editing, improving organization and content, and stylistic editing, clarifying meaning. So again, these types of editing can very much overlap and go together. Okay, now I want to read one more quote. This is from an altogether different type of text. It's actually from a book in a 3-part series on Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It's very well written by the author is Arthur Schlesinger, a well-known historian. And I just want to read this quote. His efforts to reach the people hardly helped. His language was too often abstract and unintelligible. Consider Maury Maverick of Texas confronted by Tugwell's table talk. He used more professorial language and said something about, quote, averting a revolution. I was going blind. Then, to prove the point, he said, quote, and the workers and farmers, combining their genius and, another word I couldn't get, and they shall form a nodule. I blew up completely. I said, Rex, I am sore and insulted and do not want to hear any more. Why? He asked. What in God's name is a nodule? I said. A nodule is, began Rex. Stop, stop, I shouted. Don't tell me. Whenever you use a word that I don't understand, it makes me mad. I am an American. The word nodule is not understood by the American people, nor is it understood by me, which makes it worse. And I do not want to know what it means. Nobody wants to listen to your academic phrases. Nodule my eye. Put your speech in simple language. I never heard of a nodule before, so I don't like it. Besides, I continued, it sounds like sex perversion. This I just happened upon when I was reading a work of history, and it's an actual account of something that happened related to the use of, well, jargon. And it's a very amusing example, but it really illustrates what can happen when jargon slips into to writing. Okay, yeah. So in terms of jargon, one thing that I find is that jargon can be particularly problematic when working with translated texts, from my perspective, because if I have a translated text, and let's say I don't have the source and I don't know the source language, which happens. So hypothetically, let's say that the translation was from Finnish. I have no possible way of approaching Finnish. I can't even guess at what's in Finnish. And there's a term that I can't grasp, and I can't quite Google it and find what this is, and it's not approachable. So it can be very tricky because I can't actually, I can't reasonably suggest some better way of saying this precise thing. So when it comes to translations, I feel like this is one particular advantage of working with a proofreader or copy editor who does know, at least to some degree, the source language and can take some look at that. Or, well, it doesn't have to be or, but in addition to that, it also, in my experience, is very helpful when there's as much communication as possible between the proofreader or copy editor and the translator. In a lot of cases, so for me, I work with IT companies, and so effectively they're doing in-house translation in the sense that they hire copywriters, some of whom sometimes previously worked as translators even, and these copywriters primarily write texts in English, but sometimes they also translate particularly technical texts written by programmers or other specialists within the company, and they translate those texts into English. And in those texts, I do often come across phrases that are just not really clear, that come from technical specialists. And in this case, the best solution is to, to either have access to the Russian, because I do understand Russian reasonably well, but when it comes to certain technical things, especially when people use jargon, it can still be impossible for me to actually figure out what's going on. And so the best option is to have this back and forth dialogue with the person who translated that text. And in my case, we do that most often in Google Docs. And that gives us a lot of flexibility to interact fast and sometimes even be in the document at the same time. So in that way, we do something, I don't know that we can really call it like, agile editing or something like this, but the point is it's something where you're trying to, we're speeding things up by simply, instead of leaving extensive comments back and forth, just actually working in the document and working through things. Okay. This is a quote from a senior lecturer in linguistics at Manchester Metropolitan University. This was published on the Society for Editors and Proofreaders blog. She says, when editing and proofreading, there is inevitably a need to tread the line between suggesting changes that will help the author communicate their message more effectively and ensuring that the style and voice of the author is retained. And this is always a big issue with any text, especially when doing some heavier level of editing, is to retain the author's voice. Okay, I'm gonna pause and ask a couple questions to you. So first, let's do this. How many of you have worked directly with proofreaders or editors at some point? Just raise your hand. Have worked directly with. Mm-hmm. Okay. How many of you have worked directly with English language proofreaders and editors? Mm-hmm. Okay. In your experience, what challenges have you had with keeping the style, with keeping your style and voice, or the style and voice of your translator or writer who you were working with in those projects? What challenges have you seen? Or have you seen challenges with this? Mm-hmm. Uh-huh.
I really admire the proofreader or editor who is very respectful to the translator and preserves the person's style well, yeah. and not only implements his or her own style. And I feel it's very professional when you can do that. Of course, when there are certain things to improve, it's important. But sometimes it's just like they don't see anything but their own style, you know.
Yeah, definitely. Mm-hmm. And I think that also from my experience, when people are just starting out in the field, there is more of a tendency when you're just starting out to kind of use the expression to bowl over, to simply plow through somebody's writing and simply ask the question, oh, how would I say it? But that's distinctly not what the role of the proofreader and copy editor is. It's not to ask, how would I say it? Which kind of gets back to the point of making it native. So we're trying to do that, but we're also trying to keep the voice of the author. So how do we strike this balance? But yes, I think that's very much what happens. This also, so this comment is really about what I've experienced with my clients in this particular market. So I'm not saying that this is exactly how you've seen things, but I've seen also a lot of clients I've worked with who look for a native speaker, meaning this is the qualification they want. The qualification they want is native speaker. And I think that if you look for that qualification, simply that somebody is a native speaker, you're also more likely to get somebody who rewrites things in the way they would say it. Because clearly, just as within translation, within the sphere of editing, there are so many specializations, right? I only do copy editing and proofreading of business texts, white papers, things like this, things in the social sciences. My background is in international relations and Central and Eastern European studies, so I like things related to that, and technology. But don't give me something in the medical field, because I just am not qualified to deal with that. And also, if I look at something in the medical field even, I don't know enough terminology in my native language in the medical field to actually say if something makes sense to the target audience, especially if the target audience is actually doctors. My wife knows more medical terminology in English, I think, than I do, because this is just not my sphere. Okay, did anybody else have any other comments about...
Hi, Russell.
Hi.
Okay, so we're talking about different types of editing in threading a line. I think, in my opinion, there are types of editing where the author's voice is not as important as communicating effectively with the reader.
Yeah, I agree. What would some examples of that be?
In informative texts, mostly, yeah, I'd say so. Perhaps I would tell the editor not to worry too much about keeping the voice of the author. Think of the reader in the first place. That's my opinion in some types of texts, some types of editing.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Especially if we're doing technical editing. I mean, that's not something that I don't specialize in technical editing. I do edit things that are more technical, but yes, if we're editing something that's technical and that's for developers and is a step-by-step guide, or if it's product documentation that's designed for developers, let's say, yeah, I think that generally our goal then is to just be as technically correct and to the point as possible. So yeah, I definitely agree that it really depends on the particular goal of the text. Actually, yeah, so this is actually something that relates back to, here, I have notes here that I forgot, just a second. Yeah, so this really relates back also to what Alessandro was talking about, which is that when you're localizing, you really need to know as much information as possible about your target audience and their goals and the medium. And I think that that's equally true when you're copy editing, or admittedly not quite as much if you're just proofreading something, because you should have some more context there. But if you're editing something, you also should have as much information as possible. That's another challenge that I face also, because I also very often find myself getting a task, and then my next few steps are just trying to extract information because I get, oh, we have a document. Here is a page for you to look at. Okay, like what are you trying to do with it? Who is going to read it? Will this be published on Facebook? Is this going to be sent? Are you going to reuse this on the website, or what are you doing with it? So that's something that I also face all the time. So I'm constantly trying to extract more information from clients about where actually they want to use it and who the target audience is, because then I can see whether, for instance, a certain term should be rewritten, should be explained whether an acronym should be spelled out or whether the audience can reasonably be expected to just fully understand this because they're also all specialists in this exact field. Okay, so yeah, this takes us into this slide. So if you're working with an editor, what information would be helpful to give to them? Well, more or less as much as you can in background, but certainly a style guide, description of the stakeholders, to use a kind of business term, general expectations, what do you want the editor to look at, how heavy of edits do you want, so defining those parameters. And then also about the time and money. It's possible with editing, I think, with translation, there's probably somewhat less of a possibility to simply cut down on the time. With editing, like it's theoretically possible. This was actually a test in one of my courses, was to do the most effective editing job on a text within 2 hours, where the text clearly can't fully be looked at in 2 hours. And so your goal is to catch everything that is significant and make comments on everything so that the writer can go back and incorporate these edits and make the other changes that are necessary later on. The bottom line is we also need to know, if there are these concrete expectations. Do you want to message back and forth over the course of a few days, or are you looking for whether it's possible to do this within a certain amount of time? When it comes to the style guide, that's an interesting point, because actually in my experience, none of my clients in this market, not many of my clients in this market actually have a style guide of any sort when I start working with them. So generally what they say is they want US English. And that's the extent of it. So we need to define what style they want, meaning do they prefer to follow AP style or Chicago or something else, or do they simply want to build an in-house style guide? I mean, there should be an in-house style guide on top of the other base style guide you're following, but this is another thing I come across. So certainly if you're interacting with editors, it would be helpful to provide as much information about this as possible, especially if a style guide was followed while writing the original text. It is the copy editor's job to create a style guide, mind you, but it's certainly helpful to provide background information. Okay, so let's look at one simple example here where I'm just going to show proofreading version and copy editing version. So a sports car is a car with extra features that allow it to accelerate faster and have a stunning look. So it's not a very good sentence. And this sentence didn't come directly from a client, but I took the actual structure from something that I got, meaning it said a thing is a thing with extra something, and this is the structure. So this sentence, it probably needs more than just proofreading. But here's what maybe we could do if we're just proofreading it. Something like, a sports car is a car with a stunning look and features that allow it to accelerate fast. We've done like some little minimal tweaks here, but it's still not a great sentence because it really needs something more at least. So in the copy edited version, what I came up with is sports cars look stunning and can accelerate fast. Now, at the same time, I don't necessarily like the word stunning in this sentence, so I might suggest some alternatives, or I might even suggest in comments some outright revisions of the sentence so that the author sees some different possibilities here. And we don't have context here. So clearly, we can't say too much more about it because it's a single sentence. Let's look at one longer example then. So today, marketing departments and management of product companies heavily rely on data when it comes to making decisions about product development and their promotion. There are various ways for a company to gather and process data about their users. Companies can export raw data with the help of various analytical tools or access it via direct queries to the database. It is possible to query the database just through terminal, but having a simple UI and structure to it makes it much more user-friendly. Database IDEs are tools that enable developers and marketing specialists to work with databases in a simpler and faster way. Okay, so there you have it. So I'm actually not going to take too long on the next slides, but here is an example, and it's probably actually a little too small for you to see from there. Yeah. Actually, honestly, for our purposes right now, you can focus more even on the colors that show how much has been done with it. So here in the proofreading stage, I made what I saw when I was doing this as kind of some minimum corrections to make this more readable. I got rid of, and then I added some comments to try to clarify things. I added this one comment that just says okay, and that's just intended to draw attention to the fact that I've made a change that might affect the meaning or that might not be quite what the author wants, and I want them to double check this. And then we have one version of copy editing where there are a lot more changes. And then there's another variant where there are a lot more changes. Okay, so yeah, so that's the last slide. What time is it? Oh, okay, yeah, good. Okay, so I'm going to open it up for questions. And so specifically, if you have any questions about something I talked about, or if you have questions about, for example, finding a proofreader or copy editor to work with in this market, or if you've had challenges with doing that or questions related to English language, copy editing, and proofreading. And again, my experience specifically is in the Ukrainian market.
Okay, thank you, Russell. Thank you for this presentation. You got to the point and it was very interesting. But I would like to comment that what you said perfectly applies not only to English language. It's actually virtually it applies to any language we work with. Yeah, thank you. And when I was listening to you, I was looking at our guests. And when you quoted Emerson, I noticed a kind of Mona Lisa smile on Alessandra's face. Alessandra, what do you think? What is your impression from this presentation? Are you agree with everything that Russell said, or you disagree?
It's good. I was actually saying that I was kind of interested to know whether we can work together because you're really on point. And most of the things that you say about, drawing lines between layers of editing and copy editing, it is really hard to find that balance and also to find someone to work with that agrees on such boundaries with you and keeps them, but also is able to go a bit beyond borders when you really need it and maybe you didn't figure it out as a non-native writer, possibly. So I'll pick you up for coffee.
Okay.
Thank
Thanks.
you. That's how it works at UTIC. Katya, you wanted to ask something, comment?
Russell, I'm going to suggest kind of an illegal topic to discuss, but I think we absolutely should make use of this unique opportunity while we have you. So I'm going to ask it at my own risk. As we know, we only translate and edit into the native language, but life is a bit more complicated. So at times we have to do the translation and editing into English or whatever language you have. So is there anything at all you can recommend? Is there any advice you can give like us in case we are doing that? We know that we're not native, but is there anything useful you can tell us apart from just never do it, guys?
Well, my personal opinion is not so much that you should never do it, because as a matter of fact, this is kind of what I work with. So I understand that on the other hand, some people feel like it's not necessarily best practice. I feel like, okay, some practical things you can do. It is helpful if you can find somebody who's doing the editing, who has some base knowledge of the source language. In that case, if there's a particular issue, if you know that something is problematic, you can provide just that part, at least in the original. Another thing, for sure, if you have other people to work with, I mean, if you just have, merely talking to other translators can help you figure this stuff out. Well, in terms of actual resources, actually, this book at the bottom is a particularly good resource for certain tricky things. This is an entire book on modern English usage. So, for instance, if you go to the but section, you can find starting a sentence with, and you'll find an entire, 250 words or so by Brian Garner. So Garner teaches law. He writes about legal writing. He writes about clear legal writing. And he's just crazy because he literally published this book on English usage and the Chicago Guide to Grammar Usage and Punctuation in the same year. So this one also has partially a guide to usage, but it also has a full guide to grammar and punctuation. So certain things like this are good resources. Actually, okay, another very specific thing that can be helpful if you're in this situation where you need to do something in English and it's not your native language, use Google Ngrams and use Ludwig. Google Ngrams, how many of you know about Google Ngrams? Raise your hand. Okay, so not many. Okay, Google Ngrams searches Google's whole corpus of texts that go back to, I am not even sure when the oldest ones are. By default, the search takes you from 1800 to 2000, the years, 1800 to 2000. You can modify those parameters. And in short, you can just get a graph. You can look at the saliency, meaning how frequently certain terms show up. You can find the saliency of, Shakespeare versus, James Bond over these certain years and whatever. And so this can help you figure out which phrases are actually more commonly used. And this can't tell you 100% for sure that in your context you need this, but it can tell you what is more common. Then Ludwig, and actually both of those resources, as well as some books I recommend, I have in a PDF. And so here's contact information. If you just send me a message on Telegram or send me an email, I'll send you this PDF that has links to these websites and a list of some books that I just recommend in general. So Ludwig searches only what it considers high quality sources, the New York Times, others, to find phrases in use. You can also put things in square brackets, for instance, and put words in that aren't in the order they might actually be phrased in, so you can figure out word order. This is a good way because, quite frankly, if you just Google things, you don't always find high-quality sources as top hits, and so you can't actually 100% know that you should follow the usage of that top hit on Google. Ludwig is a little better for helping you work this out, and I've seen also that other copy editors I've seen on email threads and Facebook groups that other copy editors have also recommended this, like this tool and is helpful for clients.
Thank you, Russell. I think you should expect like hundreds of messages in the near future.
It's Ludwig, and it's actually, the website is Ludwig, Ludwig.guru, Guru. They're using one of those fancy new top-level domains.
I think if you can post a comment on Facebook in a UT conference group, so that everybody can go and
I'll just do
get
that
this
with the
link.
PDF.
Okay.
Okay. Do we have any?